Welcome to the War on Drugs podcast. I'm Cardine Johnson. Join me as we take a look back at 49 years of America's longest war ever fought, where ground zero was the streets of this great nation, and casualties reached the millions.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. To fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Get your hands off the window!
The war on drugs, a nearly 5 decades-long battle fought in the streets of America. Mass incarceration, cities destroyed, generations lost, racial disparities heightened, and over $1 trillion spent in the name of eradicating public enemy number one, drug use. Over 4 decades and counting, Americans have seen the fallout from the war. No real end in sight. No winners, only losers. Drug use continues to rise today as the fight for drug prohibition wages on in new ways. So, how did we get here?
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to talk to you on a subject of deep concern to all Americans and to many people in all parts of the world, the war in Vietnam.
The year was 1971. The first microprocessor was introduced, marking the start of the digital age. The 26th Amendment was ratified, lowering the voting age in America to 18. Richard Nixon was in his 3rd year in office as the Vietnam War raged on, and dissent in America rose. The first visual war, the Vietnam War, marked the first time many Americans came face to face with the true brutality of war. Television screens, magazine covers, and newspapers were full of the devastation American soldiers were experiencing firsthand. As soldiers returned home, the atrocities had a significant impact. Battling the mental and physical wounds of war, many soldiers turned to drugs, heroin to be exact. Meanwhile, recreational drug use among civilians was on the rise. Cocaine was being glamorized by the American media, at times even billed as non-addictive. Its popularity grew and became a staple in the ever-growing nightlife scene. After running a campaign on law and order, Richard Nixon needed to do something as he saw the American he promised slipping through his fingers. July 17, 1971, President Nixon announces,
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. To fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
He sets up federally funded agencies to begin combating the rise in American drug use. He funds drug treatments in ways never seen before. Hundreds of millions of dollars poured into new programs. However, the fall of cocaine came as quickly as its rise. The glamour of drug use quickly washed away. The face of an addict was changing as a new, cheaper, more potent drug was just around the corner. The battlefield was set for the war on drugs.
Many Americans have lost confidence in what their government has told them about our policy.
Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
The 1980s, a decade marked by bold new styles, bold new technology, and most importantly, for the war on drugs, a bold new president. The election of President Ronald Reagan marked a new shift for America, a shift that would last for decades to come. Conservatism, Reaganomics, and the religious right largely defined America in the 1980s. In 1981, Ronald Reagan was elected president. As a Republican, his campaign pushed Americans to consider what they were not getting from their previous liberal presidents.
The crisis we face is not the result of any failure of the American spirit. It's a failure of our leaders to establish rational goals and give our people something to order their lives by. The human spirit thrives best when goals are set and progress can be measured in their achievement.
Just coming out of a significant recession, immense inflation, and the energy crisis of 1979, many Americans were seeking a change that would bring prosperity to the nation once again. When Reagan took office, he made good on his promises, creating a stronger military force, a stronger economy, and stronger federally funded programs to fight the war on drugs. As the 80s ushered in a new wave of political change for America, a new wave of drug use was well underway. By the 1980s, cocaine was a thing of the past. The new drug sweeping the nation, crack, the cheaper, more addictive, and more potent version of cocaine.
This is it. The drug so powerful it will empty the money from your pockets, make you sell the watch off your wrist, the clothes off your back.
Many of the people who use crack are turning up with blown minds and blown bank accounts and worse.
Hundreds of other narcotics cases in county after county, and you'll get some idea of how drugs, especially crack, are affecting our courts every day.
Cocaine is a stimulant found in a powdered form. It can be snorted, smoked, or injected. It takes 3 to 5 minutes to consume, and the high can last up to 1 hour. Crack cocaine is the result of combining cocaine, baking soda, water, boiling it, and allowing a solid substance to form. That solid is broken into crack rocks. The high is immediate, and the crash that follows is just as fast, making the probability of addiction sky high. By the start of Reagan's second term, he had spent over $1 billion and promised even more to battle the war on drugs. In 1986, President Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act.
The magnitude of today's drug problem can be traced to past unwillingness to recognize and confront this problem. And the vaccine that's going to end the epidemic is a combination of tough laws like the one we signed today and a dramatic change in public attitude.
In one fell swoop, America saw the passing of its most damning drug laws to date. A moment in history that would forever be marked as the spark that ignited an uncontrollable flame of mass incarceration in America. As incarceration rose for non-violent drug offenders, racial disparities became more apparent. No piece of legislation demonstrates this better than the 100-to-1 rule. 50 grams of crack calls for a 10-year minimum sentence in prison, while it would take 5,000 grams of cocaine to result in the same sentencing. This approach also placed a higher incarceration rate for low-level users than the large drug manufacturers. But how did this lead to racial disparities? Crack, the new cheap alternative to cocaine, was flooding the streets of lower-class communities with high Black and Latino populations. When America prosecuted crack, America prosecuted its communities of color. Under these new laws, like the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, harsh minimum penalties were set, increasing America's prison population by hundreds of thousands within a few short years.
It's been quite a journey this decade, and we held together through some stormy seas. And at the end, together, we're reaching our destination.
Let us roll up our sleeves to roll back this awful tide of violence and reduce crime in our country.
Super predators, no conscience, no empathy.
The violence associated with drugs is spewing out all over America.
In 1993, American politics transitioned back to Democratic control. However, it was not as liberal as years past. Instead, America saw a rise in neoliberal politics that maintained fiscal and to a lesser extent social conservatism. While the face and temperament of American politics were changing, the war on drugs raged on as crack still littered the streets of America's cities, and non-violent drug offenders littered American prisons by the thousands. On January 20th, 1993, Bill Clinton was sworn into office. Within a year of taking office, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 was passed.
From this day forward, let us put partisanship behind us, and let us go forward, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, law enforcement, community leaders, ordinary citizens. Let us roll up our sleeves to roll back this awful tide of violence and reduce crime in our country. We have the tools now. Let us get about the business of using them.
The most significant crime bill to date in American history. It provided billions in funding for new prisons, expansion of law enforcement by the thousands, and ultimately expanded federal penalties for non-violent drug-related crimes. Most notably, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act created new death penalty offenses for non-lethal drug-related crimes. This sweeping legislation also introduced the three-strike rule, which placed a lifetime imprisonment sentence on those convicted of 3 violent felony offenses. These policies were heightened by new regulations that allowed children as young as 13 to be tried as adults, and supposed gang-related offenses resulting in harsher, punitive punishment. Compounding with previous legislation that placed higher penalties on drug charges associated with crack, the Clinton presidency and the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 set the stage for staggering disparities defined by race and class. In the midst of these new and harsher punishments, safety nets created by the New Deal weakened. Welfare reform under President Clinton was swift and stark.
Today we are ending welfare as we know it.
Public housing could be denied to an entire family if someone was suspected of a drug-related crime. Nutritional assistance was peeled away layer by layer for families in need. Phase-out programs took away public assistance money for each dollar earned, placing families deeper and deeper in cycles of poverty. Meanwhile, in prisons, marginalized communities were incarcerated at higher rates and also saw more and more of their liberties stripped away. While incarcerated, convicted felons were no longer able to continue their education as they once were under the new crime bill because they could not earn federally funded education grants. The continued war on drugs, shaped by the most substantial crime bill in history, welfare reform, and ultimately the Clinton presidency of the 1990s, laid the groundwork for the disenfranchisement of the minority population of America for years to come.
The war on drugs, a war that has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color.
Primary driver of this mass incarceration phenomenon is our drug laws.
America's crack epidemic waned at the start of the new millennium, replaced by a new epidemic in recent years. Opioid use in America is on the rise. Over the course of nearly 5 decades, the war on drugs still wages on. Today, the public and the political response to drug use is one of acceptance, calls for legalization and rehabilitation. As the face of American drug user gets lighter, the penalties follow suit. Drug abuse is no longer a moral issue, but a health issue. Has America simply learned from its mistakes in the past? Understanding that attacking the demands of drugs is not the solution? Or has America's racist history continued on and shaped the response to these new white drug users? Black and brown communities still feel the burden of the war on drugs. From school to prison pipelines to redlining, communities of color are still fighting the battles left by the war on drugs. While Black Americans make up only 12% of the population, they make up 30% of all drug-related arrests, as they are 4 times more likely to be arrested and 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than their white counterparts. 49 years, $1 trillion, and millions of lives later, the war on drugs leaves a legacy fraught with racist bias, political heavy-handedness, and community harm that is yet to be undone.